on behalf of Friends of Europe, a warm welcome to all of you. I must admit, after 2 years of Zoom hibernation, it's great to have a live studio audience, as they say on TV, to see so many of you down here at Town Hall Europe this afternoon. So a particular thanks to you for making the physical effort to come and be with us today. It definitely lifts the spirits and raises the morale. Let me also welcome and greet and thank those who are joining us online. Great to see you, or at least know that you are there, somewhere behind me on the screen. And welcome to our Friends of Europe Annual Security Summit 2021 version. And for that, we have chosen this very catchy title of Strategic Foresight, a Zero-Sum Game. I don't know where we get these titles from, really, but we will elucidate what this all means over the course of the next 3 hours in 3 lively, quick, snappy sessions. And I, Jamie Shea, the Senior Fellow here at Friends of Europe, will have the privilege of moderating the first and the last, and Mary Fitzgerald, my colleague, will come in the middle. And for our first session, we want to look at NATO and the EU, particularly how the current developments, particularly with the EU now looking at the first draft of its strategic compass, its future strategy document, and over at NATO, work is starting on the upgrade of NATO's strategic concept. It's quite rare that these two processes should be sort of happening in the same town at the same time. And I'm not claiming any great originality for this, but we thought that this would be an excellent opportunity to see how the two big beasts of the Brussels scene, NATO and the EU, are getting on with their conceptual exercises, and what the prospects are of using these exercises to bring the two institutions even closer together. This is because, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, Friends of Europe has a long history of bringing NATO and the EU closer together. We started back in the 1990s when it wasn't so simple or obvious with the old security and defence agenda. Now probably the two institutions don't need us as much because they seem to be getting on with their interrelationship perfectly well by themselves. But nonetheless, we in the think tank community like to track developments to see where things are and see if we can also, from time to time, inject some ideas or thoughts or proposals to drive the process forward. Now, NATO and the EU, as you all know, have come a long way. 2 joint declarations, maybe a third in the offing before NATO's next summit in Madrid next June. Working agreements on things like cybersecurity, hybrid activities, resilience, disinformation campaigns, working on capability developments, coordinating on exercises and crisis management, and turning up at each other's meetings. I noted that the NATO Secretary General, my old boss, Jens Stoltenberg, was with EU defence ministers at lunch yesterday. So they are increasingly speaking the same language. They are more politically and intellectually aligned than they've been before. But as those of us in the think tank community often sense it, it's rather like the horizon. No matter how far you've come, with the horizon, it always seems to be further afield. So there always seems to be so much more that needs to be done. The current crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border shows how the capabilities of both organisations need to come into play if we're to be successful. NATO, of course, with solidarity, with perhaps specialist equipment to help Poland, Lithuania, Latvia manage the situation on the border. But, of course, the EU, with all of its diplomatic and economic and humanitarian instruments, working on the roots of the crisis, to try to stem the flow of the migrants, but to make sure that those who are there are handled in the most humane way possible. As we look to the future, we also identify some big questions and opportunities. Will the strategic concept exercises, the compass exercises, be exploited to really bring the organisations closer together? And if so, what needs to be done? In which areas? Secondly, given all of the multiple challenges that we are facing today, to what extent do these two organisations need to develop sort of common strategies to work together in the Middle East, in Africa, on big issues like nuclear proliferation, the NPT review conference, the more competitive world that we face? Are the responses so far good enough? And finally, how can European strategic autonomy, something that we've been really obsessed with here at Friends of Europe for many years already, how can this not only strengthen Europe, but also the transatlantic relationship? In a nutshell, how can the EU best support NATO, given the overlapping memberships, but also how can NATO, at a time when the EU is increasingly doing the missions overseas, particularly in Africa, how can NATO also help more the European Union to be successful? Fortunately, I don't have to answer these difficult questions. It's really the luxury of a moderator to get to ask the questions, but to then call on the experts to provide the answers. So we have 5 of the best today who really can give us the answers. First of all, we have Charles Friis, who is the Deputy Secretary General for the Common Security and Defence Policy in the European External Action Service. Charles is a good friend of Friends of Europe. He's with us in person here today, so a warm welcome as the first speaker. Then we have joining us via video link Molly Montgomery, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and European Affairs in Washington. Great to have a transatlantic perspective today. And I'm delighted to welcome back to Friends of Europe Cristina Gallach, who is very well known in this town from her time both at NATO and the EU. She was my colleague at one stage, but then, like a sprinter, she left me totally behind and went on to the UN as the Under-Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, and then into the Spanish government, of course, of the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs. So Cristina can't be with us in person, but hopefully she's up on the line as well. So what we're going to do is have the 3 speakers in a quick first round, short fire comments. I've asked them to keep it to 5 minutes, which I should actually do myself as the moderator. Then we're going to have a couple of questions, so be ready, dear audience, to take advantage. And then we'll go to a second round in which I will be delighted to introduce, again, one of my dear ex-colleagues from NATO, Benedetta Berti. She doesn't need any introduction either in Brussels or beyond, but she's head of policy planning in the office of the Secretary General of NATO. And if you want to know about the NATO strategic concept, there is no better person to ask. And then last, but by no means least, and I really stress that, we have General Robert Brieger, who is the Chief of Defence in Austria, but he will be becoming our neighbour in Brussels next May when he will replace General Graziano as the chairman of the EU, chair of the EU Military Committee. So we've got, as I say, 5 of the best. Let me stop immediately and go straight to the first speakers to try at least to answer some of the questions that I posed. Charles, again, great to see you. The real microphone. I also have to say the virtual microphone, but I'm delighted to say the real microphone is now yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I'm happy to be here this afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here because I think your conference organized by Friends of Europe is very timely. As you said, the strategic compass was presented 2 days ago by the High Representative. I've not done anything. That is working. It has been presented. It was presented last Monday by José Borrell to the ministers of defense and foreign affairs ministers of the European Union. And in addition, yesterday we had our traditional defense meeting, and there was this invitation of NATO Secretary General where we precisely discussed how we can promote the cooperation between NATO and the EU. So I would like to make 4 short remarks. First, it's obvious that the EU and NATO, they face similar threats and challenges. Crisis in multilateralism, with all the problems we face in the UN Security Council because of the attitude of some members. The return to power politics, marked by this rising rivalry between China and the US, and also by the determination of some actors, particularly Russia, to expand their political space. We have also a competition of political systems, a real battle of narratives, illustrated, for instance, last year with the disinformation and the weaponization of what we call weaponization of soft power, with, for instance, mask diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy, particularly with China. So all this, and of course, we all have in mind what's happening right now at the border between Belarus and Poland and Lithuania, with this instrumentalization of irregular migration flows. So. And I don't forget the classic traditional conflicts and instability at our own borders. I have in mind what's happening in Libya, what's happening in Ukraine, or what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I don't forget also the persistent terrorist threat. So if you take all these challenges, all these threats, all these risks that the EU is facing, you can see that NATO is facing almost the same list of threats and challenges. That's why we need, obviously, to have a sort of common approach in order to be together to face all this new and dangerous geopolitical environment. My second remark is that against this backdrop, it's obvious that transatlantic unity and a stronger Europe go hand in hand. NATO, I want to be clear here, NATO is and will remain central to the European security architecture. And NATO is in charge of collective defense, and for European members who are not only members of the EU but also members of NATO, as you know, it's enshrined in the Treaty on the European Union. But at the same time, we consider at the EU level that we need to take more responsibility for our own security. And so you understand that the challenge is to try to say that the stronger we are as Europeans, the better it will be for NATO. That's the main message that was also sent and conveyed yesterday by the High Representative. So we think that we need, because we want to take more responsibility for our own security, we need to be able to act together with partners each time it's possible, but also alone if we don't have the choice, if we must. And this is why the EU has been deploying now for many years and currently 18 military and civilian missions and operations in the neighborhood, for instance in Bosnia and Herzegovina with NATO assets, in the Sahel, off the coast of Libya, or more recently in Mozambique. So the EU wants to be a more credible and a more efficient security provider. We are also, at the level of the EU, we are also developing our efforts in the area of capability development through what we call the PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, or with the funding of the European Defence Fund. We are not developing, and I insist on this because sometimes I hear this narrative coming from NATO, we are not developing EU capabilities. The capabilities which are developed in the EU member state, there are always capabilities that remain at the end in the hands of member states. So they are fully consistent with NATO priorities, what we call the NDPP process, and the capabilities developed by European member states, they can be developed for EU operations, but obviously also they can be used in a NATO context. And so we always said that the stronger we are, the more we invest in defense, the more we spend in defense, the better it is for the transatlantic bond, and also the better it is for the burden sharing, which is something regularly asked, particularly by our American friends. So there is no competition between our two organizations. There is no competition. The EU is a partner of NATO. NATO is for the EU a strategic partner, and once again, by getting stronger, we consider that the EU will be a better partner for NATO. It's because we will be stronger that we will be considered and seen as a more reliable partner, and so at the end a better partner for NATO. So it's really a mutually reinforcing partnership. My third remark, you mentioned that in your preliminary remarks. It's true that we have, for the moment, two parallel processes. The strategic compass, which will be adopted by March 2022 at the level of the EU, and the strategic concept, which will be adopted by NATO at the Madrid summit in June. And so it's obvious that we need to ensure the coherence between these two reflection processes. On the EU side, High Representative Borrell presented a first draft, as I said 2 days ago, to the ministers, and this compass sets out concrete actions for the next 5 to 10 years. Our idea is to see how we can improve the way the EU acts and responds to crisis. And for example, we have put forward some very concrete proposals in order to take decisions faster. We know that sometimes we are criticized because we are too slow. So we put some proposals to be more efficient in terms of decision-making process, being more flexible, to have more robust mandates, and also this new idea that we should develop an EU rapid deployment capacity. We consider that we should not only act, but also protect the Union and its citizens against particularly cyber attacks, hybrid threats, and that's why we have proposed to put in place what we call an EU hybrid toolbox, which will be particularly relevant to address what we call foreign information manipulation. And we want also, when we think that we have to secure the interests of member states, European member states, we want also to secure the access of Europeans to the cyberspace, but also to the maritime domain and also to space. And we think that's all. To act, to protect. The third pillar of the compass is to invest. We must invest more in critical capability shortfalls because the EU has to promote its own industrial and technological defense base, and we need to we need to reduce the fragmentation of our defense markets. And last pillar, the compass will propose more ambitious partnerships and cooperation on security and defense, and obviously, particularly with NATO, and that's why we think that because we have these two reflection processes, we need to in the coming weeks, coming months, to work on this more links and more cooperation. And that's my last remark. Yeah. The new joint statement, you made a reference to this. We are working on that. We think that this new joint declaration should not only help us deep our partnership in existing key areas of cooperation, but also identify some new areas of cooperation, such as emerging and disruptive technologies, EDTs, resilience, climate and defense, and space. So here are 4 concrete examples where we think NATO and the EU should expand their cooperation.
Charles, thank you.
Thank you.
Charles, thank you, Charles, and thanks for saying a lot in a short space of time. One question that I think would be in the minds of our audience as we go through the speakers is, great that the EU and NATO are willing to sort of work, be transparent about each other's processes, but how do they sort of mesh them in practical terms? Is that possible? Will there be some kind of coordination? The second thing, I was going to ask you that with 74 joint sort of cooperation ideas in the first 2 declarations, what is left for a third declaration? But Charles, you brilliantly anticipated that question by mentioning the disruptive technologies, space, climate, and so on. Those are extremely important. So thanks, you got us off to an excellent start. Now I turn to Molly Montgomery. She's on the screen. You could see her with the US flag behind, which means that she's definitely at the State Department in Washington, D.C. Molly, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, obviously, I think the question in this town, but you know it because you know Europe so well, is how is the United States looking at this European strategic autonomy idea? You seem to be warming up to this idea over in Washington, but what would you actually like to see the Europeans do? And secondly, the EU and the US are now talking together a lot more about defence issues. What do you talk about to the EU directly that you don't sort of talk to the Europeans about in NATO? So those are two things on my mind, but we're really delighted to have you, hopefully in person as soon as you can make it over to Brussels. But the virtual microphone now goes to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I would really love to be there in person and hopefully next time, COVID permitting, but it's really terrific to be here to discuss an issue that is really of great importance, but also relevance at the moment. And we really have welcomed the launch of the strategic compass or let's say it's being discussed among member states. We look forward to having consultations on it as we go forward. But I think, I will disappoint you in terms of not having too much that is actually that different than what Charles had to say, which I think is a mark of just how close the relationship between the United States and the EU is at the moment, and what a shared perception there is of the threats that we face and of how we need to move forward together as a transatlantic alliance. As you know, the Biden administration has really focused throughout and from the first day on rebuilding our alliances and our partnerships, particularly with Europe. Obviously, for us, NATO is the cornerstone of transatlantic security and will always remain so. But we also view the EU as an increasingly important partner, and our goal has really been to raise the level of ambition in our partnership with the EU, and that includes on security and defense. And so, as you mentioned, in June at the US-EU summit, the presidents agreed on the launch of a security and defense dialogue. We hope to have more coming on that very soon. But I think this is really just a mark of the need for us to coordinate closely on all of these questions that you have already raised. Because for us, we really do believe that a stronger Europe is in US interests, but that it also requires us to ensure that we remain coordinated, to ensure that all of these efforts that the EU is undertaking are complementary with NATO and really do contribute positively to the capabilities that Europe brings to bear and to global security. And I think the focus on capabilities is really key here in both the EU and NATO contexts. And so that's one area where we really look forward to cooperating with the EU and think that the increased focus on security and defense will benefit both the EU and NATO and Europe as a whole in terms of its ability to confront the challenges that we face. And so we're really glad to see these conversations about what Europe needs to do to be able to do more. That can be helpful in both the NATO and EU context, certainly, and is something, as you mentioned, that we, and as Charles mentioned, that we have been banging a drum about since the Obama administration. And so those are conversations we really look forward to having in terms of how we can work together to ensure that Europe has the capabilities it needs that match the threat picture that we hope will be a common threat picture that we share across the Atlantic. And so for that reason, it's really important that the EU has committed to the fullest possible participation of third states, including the United States, in PESCO projects. We are really glad to be participating in the Dutch-led military mobility project, and I think it just proves that there is a lot more that we can do together, the US and the EU on this front. We're also looking forward to concluding, hopefully very quickly, an administrative arrangement with the European Defence Agency that would allow us to participate in other projects that have EDF funding. And so these are important conversations that are well underway and where we've already seen some progress in this administration. Just briefly, I really agree with what Charles said about the need to update and ensure that we do have a common threat picture. And I think we're all aware of the vast array of challenges we face, certainly from Russia and China, from emerging technologies and unconventional threats. And I think there's a lot of convergence that we see there. NATO-EU cooperation is essential. as we go forward in these reflection processes, certainly. But beyond that, as we've all noted, in terms of the work on this huge array of areas where we've already identified that NATO-EU cooperation needs to take place, but particularly for the United States, areas where we would like to see focus on NATO-EU cooperation are on China, military mobility, operations and activities, cyber and hybrid, and also on emerging security challenges. And so these are areas where we really look forward to facilitating greater cooperation, and we welcome the idea of a third declaration. Just very briefly, I also want to touch on the picture beyond the EU and NATO, because we know that although we're focused on the transatlantic space, that the threats and challenges we face often emanate from beyond our direct area. And so one of our focuses really is on knitting together our allies and partners in Europe and beyond. And so that's why we really welcomed the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. And we're really focused on ensuring that there is greater connectivity between the transatlantic alliance, but also our allies and partners in the Asia-Pacific. And for that reason, we really are focused as well on the participation of the AP4 in NATO activities, and just ensuring that we have greater connectivity.
Molly, I have to ask you to wrap up. I really apologize. It's just we're under such extreme time pressure. But let me give you two sentences, obviously, to allow you to conclude. Because
I was really at the end, but all I'll just say is that consultation will really be critical throughout, and especially as we get to the details of things like the proposed rapid deployment capability and other areas where we just want to really ensure that, as you said, the EU and NATO are really knitted together in terms of ensuring that there's complementarity and no duplication.
Molly, thanks. That was a very clear, very substantive statement. So thank you very much. Now I turn to Cristina. Always a pleasure for me because of our good friendship. Cristina, since you left Brussels, you've been looking very much at the global scene in your UN capacity as the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs. So what I was hoping that you could do today, and it's great to see you, is give us a sort of sense of how effective you think this kind of cooperation in Brussels is in sort of influencing those kind of global developments that Molly was referring to at the end of her statement. Anyway, the virtual microphone is yours. Over to you. Give us the summary of the world in 5 minutes. You could do it. We got some sound? We need to unmute, either at our end or at Cristina's end. Do we have sound? No, is it at Cristina's end or is it at our end?
Let me see if now it's better.
It's great. Not only better, massively
Hello,
different.
Jamie. Hello, Jamie. Hello, colleagues. I'm still hibernating, so I'm not in Brussels. I should be coming soon. And as you see, my backdrop has no flags. So at this point, it's clear that I do not represent the Spanish government, but I will also address you with thoughts and ideas that we developed during my tenure as a state secretary. So truly, Jamie, the global picture is so complex that we have a tremendous opportunity, EU and NATO, to work more efficiently together to face the extremely complex challenges in the world. And I think this opportunity is because we have this process of both organizations going through reflection and going through prioritization with the two processes, the strategic compass and the strategic concept. So I think ahead of us, we have an opportunity. We should not miss it. I think we must use it, because the coincidence of analysis, as Charles was saying, is quite total. We see the complexity of the challenges in security terms. We see issues related to the fact of our inability to end together territorial issues, the traditional threats, but also the new threats. Some of them have already been posed. So the opportunity is there, and we shouldn't miss. I think another point, and that will be my third point, the first one is the confluence of processes, the second one, the analysis, and the third one is capabilities. The fact that the European Union is so clearly focusing in reinforcing capabilities, and in particularly the new and most needed capabilities for the new threats, is extremely important. And I think we have to use this, and NATO has already done a lot of work on that through the Agenda 2030, and is going to do more in the strategic concept. So it's important. I think the ambitions that the European Union poses on the table is a continuation of what is being done in PESCO, of the European Defence Fund, and I think we are bringing solutions to this extremely important part, which is capabilities. Because member states do not have two sets of capabilities. We only have one set of capability that we need to put at the disposal of the EU or at the disposal of NATO. Therefore, we cannot afford not to cooperate. And that is why it's so important to put suspicions aside while we are talking about the strategic autonomy. The strategic autonomy is a great opportunity for the European Union, individual member states and collective structures to become more efficient and to be more forceful in these actions. And I think in this category of member state, I think it is important to raise the question of the United States. We heard from Molly how important it is now that the US has a dialogue on security and defense with the European Union. It can only help to clarify issues that in some moments have been complicating. Let me go for a fifth point, which I think is more practical, is where can we more together work in, I would underline Mediterranean and Africa. And I would also make a strong line on maritime security. And in Africa, you'd mentioned Sahel. We already have heard from Charles how the EU is getting slowly involved in Mozambique and the Gulf of Guinea, where we have this major security threat, piracy, terrorism, which is moving from Asia and Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq in particular, and Syria to Africa. I think it is very important. It's an area where we can do a lot more together. The EU has a more diversity palette of instruments, but an adequate presence of NATO, collaboration of NATO can be extremely important. Just see the Sahel, where it is so hard to have an advance. And my last point is going to be in Afghanistan, because here, both us, EU and NATO and EU member states and NATO member states ought to reflect on how badly have things ended in Afghanistan, just with the figure that 95% of the population in the world, in Afghanistan, will be suffering from serious challenges, from energy, lack of energy, total lack of energy, or even fall beyond
Cristina, I need to ask you to bring it to an end. I hate to do this. The moderator's role is not a nice one, but you've got six very punchy points in there. So one sentence just to conclude.
Sentence to conclude is an opportunity to work together. We ought to find practical ways to do so. We have identified a few of them in the new technologies, but I think regional cooperation in Mediterranean and Africa is key. Thank you.
Cristina, that was great. You did everything in 6 points and in 6 minutes. It was a tour de force. Thank you, Cristina. And I again apologise that we are under the dictatorship of the clock today. As you know, dear audience, no Security Summit of Friends of Europe is complete without an intervention by, one of my former bosses, Jaap de Hoop-Scheffer, the former Secretary General of NATO, former Dutch Foreign Minister. As you know, he normally is in Brussels on these occasions moderating the sessions. Today he can't join us, he's up in The Hague, but we didn't want to not have him give briefly, like everybody else, his perspective on the debate thus far. So Jaap, I dearly hope that you are plugged in and you are there, and that we're going to see you and more importantly hear from you right now in just a couple of moments, because of course we still have 2 good speakers to go. Jaap, are you there, and what would you like to comment on?
Thank you, Jamie. I'm here, and thank you for moderating this session. I'll be extremely brief. A few questions, because I have the same luxury as you have, Jamie, to ask questions in my present non-capacity. First of all, how do we envisage, when we talk about Europe, not the European Union, but Europe, how are we going to link up with the United Kingdom when we talk defense, when we talk operations? I mean, there is of course, EU and Europe is not the same, but the United Kingdom is extremely relevant, because if the European Union or Europe would decide to act without the United States, first of all, I think you need beefing up Berlin Plus. Charles Fries indirectly mentioned Berlin Plus when he was talking about Operation Althea in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And my question then would be, are the political hurdles, Cyprus, Turkey, cleared in the meantime? Or do we have certain blockages there in that regard? So the role of the United Kingdom in NATO, of course, is crystal clear, but it's less clear in the framework of the EU. And I would be very much in favor of keeping them as close to us as possible, given the fact that after Brexit, when you look at the European Union militarily, it's basically only France and a number of medium-sized and smaller nations, because Germany, as we all know, will never be in the forefront in this kind of debates. Is Germany ready for this all? My question would be. Penultimate point, I think it was also Molly Montgomery who mentioned the US ambition as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. Where should we have our priorities? Where should the European Union have its priorities? Is that in the immediate neighborhood? Cristina mentioned, I can mention the Western Balkans, the Black Sea, North Africa, the Sahel, the Eastern Med. You can't be everywhere and anywhere. You can't pay attention to the whole world. So is that a priority? Or should we, given the fact that we are living in times of US-China rivalry, should we, as much as we can, and that means developing an Indo-Pacific strategy, should we, together with the United States, be active, proactive members of the family of democracies? I mean, that's a different prioritization we would have. And final remark, Jamie. Finance has not been mentioned yet, but rapid deployment capacity. Cristina, you're very right. One single set of forces. We have no EU and no NATO soldiers. We have just soldiers. But Jamie, you know as well as I do that when we discuss common funding in NATO, that's a very complicated discussion. And we can have huge ambitions, and they're fine and they're nice. But as long as the majority of European nations is dramatically underfunding defense, I mean, are we not a group of people whistling in the dark? I mean, it's absolutely necessary. And I disagreed with President Trump on almost anything, but I could agree with him when he was critically approaching the European allies in spending on defense. Yeah. Jamie, I'll stop here because I know you're pressed for time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. But first of all, thanks for coming in. As I say, we couldn't possibly have a security summit without you. And thanks, as always, for finding interesting new angles and things to add to the discussion, but always in your inimitable style, putting our attention on the hard choices and the concrete realities as well. It's not all about strategy, it's about means. Let's carry on because we still have two speakers and we must hear from them. Hopefully we're still going to have some time for some quick questions at the end. So I mentioned Benedetta Berti, who is well known, is the key person, the go-to person on the NATO strategic concept work, as she was for the work on NATO 2030, which has been mentioned. So Benedetta, thanks again for coming down here today. Great to see you. Tell us where things are going out at NATO HQ and what you also would see this process achieving in terms of this NATO-EU relationship, which is our focus today.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie, and I'll try to answer all of that in 5 minutes. So let's challenge accepted. So in terms of the process, as you know better than me and probably most people on Earth, this is going to be the 8th time that NATO goes through this process of developing a strategic concept. It will be the 4th since the end of the Cold War, and basically the strategic concept is NATO's expression of grand strategy. It's how we forge transatlantic unity, is how we tell the world what NATO is for. We come together to agree a shared threat picture, and then on that basis we discuss what we need to do as an alliance and drive our forward adaptation. So it is a very important exercise, and I would say it's important especially politically because it gives us a chance to reinforce transatlantic unity and to forge convergence over new emerging challenges. For example, how do we approach together China's increasingly assertive role on the world stage, for example. I would put that on the table because that's, of course, a very important question for the strategic concept. Just to try to chime in with the very important debate that has happened so far, I would say that the issue of NATO-EU cooperation, of course, feeds into our thinking towards the strategic concept. And I think that the first point I wanted to make, based on what I've heard so far, is that I think we all agree that this is no time for bickering, no time for institutional competition. It just doesn't help. If we all agree, and I think that's an assumption I'm willing to make, that our security environment is deteriorating, that the Euro-Atlantic area is in a complex situation like it had never been before since the end of the Cold War, I would say, and and things are changing at the global level. Many people mention here strategic competition. I think this is a defining trend that is going to change, and it is altering the way we approach almost everything. I mean, we are being challenged across domains, technological, political, ideological, military, and I think that's a game changer. So if we agree that that's the picture we're looking at, and it's a grim one, then I think that it's no time to bicker, it's no time to compete, and it's definitely the time to keep our friends closer, even closer. So I would say this is the time to work together more than ever. And when I say work together more than ever, of course I mean NATO-EU, that's very important, but I fundamentally mean North America and Europe. As you know, North America and Europe working together have managed to protect our common freedom and security for about 7 decades. But if you look to the future, it's going to be even harder for us to compete. It's going to be even harder for us to deal with systemic challengers if we do not stick together. So that's also important because I think that as we think about what more we could do institutionally, we cannot lose sight of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that North America and Europe need to continue to work together. Transatlantic unity continues to underpin our security. NATO remains the cornerstone of collective defense, but it's also the organizing principle. That's how we plan and execute our collective defense in Europe. And just to respond to one of the points, very important points made by the former Secretary General about where do we get all Europe discussing together and consulting about security, I want to put his mind at rest. We do that every day at NATO. We have the United States, we have Canada, we have Norway, we have the United Kingdom, and that's how we meet every day to take the joint decisions that we need to take to protect our common security. So in that sense, I think it's really important that we see it in the right framework, and that's the framework that we need to preserve. That said, within that framework, it's clear that a stronger NATO-EU cooperation helps foster our common goals. It's also clear, I would say, that when the European Union and when European member states of NATO talk about an increasingly stronger role for the EU or increasingly stronger role when it comes to defense, I think that's something that we have welcomed on numerous occasions. This is a good development. Having a more responsible Europe is a good development. And European defense efforts that are complementary to NATO and that do not duplicate, of course, that's going to be something that only multiplies and adds to our security. The point of caution, and it's not a point of caution, the important point that I've heard throughout the debate is this emphasis on capabilities, and I think that is fantastic. The more we remain output-oriented, the better. The more we talk about what can European member states develop together, what type of capability, what type of concrete input can we use to support our security, I think that's much more useful than getting a bit derailed about duplication of institutions, structures, and of course that's something that does not help when you have one single set of forces.
Gotcha.
So I would say that's my reaction to the comments.
Benedetta, thank you for, again, packing a lot of information and insights into a short space. And also, again, pointing to the need to be practical and pragmatic with all of the stresses that we have. This is no time for false debates. We need to focus on the essential. So we now turn to General Brieger. Again, at any kind of security and defense conference, you need to have a military voice. Obviously, they are 50% of the policy and the implementation. I'm delighted from Vienna to welcome General Brieger. I've introduced him already as the head of the Austrian Armed Forces, the incoming EU chairman of the EU Military Committee. What I hope the General could comment on, and again in the magical 5 minutes, is how does a military mind look at these sort of issues, particularly where he would like to see EU military capabilities improve most urgently, what's lacking. A question, General, forgive me, but I ask it all the time. You know, we hear a lot about PESCO and the projects, but we don't hear so much about what they're actually achieving in terms of, you know, what's coming off the production line at the other end now that this process has been up and running for a while. You know, where would you see, for example, an EU rapid deployment forces really adding to your sort of quiver of capabilities? So it's great to end our lineup of speakers with a senior military perspective. So General Brieger, please provide that perspective for us. The virtual microphone is yours.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for inviting me to this highly relevant discussion. EU and NATO are currently reviewing their respective strategic documents and concepts. On the level of 27, we have agreed that this is an opportunity for improving the cooperation between the two organizations. The two processes should be seen as a chance for further deepening our strategic thinking and developing complementary approaches while taking into account the different political natures of EU and NATO. It's of utmost importance to seize this opportunity for making real progress on urgent strategic questions. The title of this panel addresses two essential elements of this process: common threat assessment and perspective for enhancing EU-NATO cooperation. My main argument is EU-NATO cooperation should not be seen as a zero-sum game, but as a positive sum. That means a stronger EU also strengthens NATO, or in other words, more strategic responsibility by the EU based on enhanced European ability to act and transatlantic cooperation are not contradictory, but two sides of the same coin. Let me briefly comment on the strategic compass and its threat assessment to be followed by some thoughts on future NATO-EU cooperations. The compass started with a comprehensive threat analysis. This first ever comprehensive EU threat analysis in 2020 was an important starting point. In my view, we should therefore regularly review this analysis and use it as a reference document for constantly adopting our policies. The main result of the EU threat assessment, in one sentence, to quote HR Borrell, is that Europe is in danger. We are facing old and new threats, external and internal challenges at the same time. Not only military means, but information, cyber domains, space, migrants, technologies, and communication lines are used as instruments for power projection and enforcement of political interests. Currently, we see this clearly on the Belarusian border. At the same time, regional conflicts in and around Europe persist, and it seems that the only stability in the Euro-strategic neighborhood is its instability. These developments take place against the background of growing strategic competition amongst major global actors, with the bipolarity between USA and China at its core. Based on the contribution of 27, the work on the strategic compass is currently in its final stages. From the compass, we do not only expect general guidelines that would be followed by further regulations, but we urgently need to concrete steps with corresponding timelines. The present draft is promising in this respect. There is a clear demand for the capability to act autonomously, and the decision-making process needs to be accelerated. It should be clear that strategic autonomy does not exclude cooperation, also a resilient C2 structure will be necessary. In this new geopolitical environment, remaining a relevant international actor and avoiding strategic irrelevance has become an essential strategic challenge and task for the EU. We have to bear this in mind when we discuss EU-NATO relations. For the EU progress in its capability to act, it's not only a technical military question, but has become an essential precondition for avoiding strategic irrelevance. Which way ahead for EU-NATO relations? Since 2016, EU-NATO cooperation has been increased substantially, driven by 2 EU-NATO declarations. Today's cooperation program comprises 74 projects. In my opinion, it would be reasonable that NATO's new strategic concept recognizes the added value of a more capable EU defense in complementary with NATO for transatlantic security. And in reciprocity for the strategic compass of the EU should be underlined the importance of NATO's role for deterrence and territorial collective defense. Based on this basic assumption, the third joint EU-NATO declaration, which is currently under discussion, should give clear guidance for deepening the political and military dialogue, including EU-MC and NATO-MC informal meetings. Further areas for stepping up gears are cooperation on disruptive technologies, climate and defense and resilience, as well as countering hybrid threats, space, maritime security, and especially common exercises. In my view, exercises will play an important role not only for safeguarding operational readiness, but also as a means for showing the flag and demonstrating the resoluteness of both organizations. But we must be realistic that there are still long-standing obstacles to EU-NATO cooperation, which require political guidance. Full involvement of all EU member states is a precondition for substantially deepening cooperation. In this regard, I have to mention not only the tensions between Turkey and Cyprus, but also that Austria is blocked in many of its military cooperation activities in the PFP framework. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, the time for making real progress is now. What we need to raise the game for both institutions is first, to become more operational in our day-to-day cooperation. Second, expand our cooperation menu beyond pure crisis management by including the broad spectrum of enhancing resilience. And third, finally, we need clear political guidance when we then implement with the necessary strategic flexibility. In my personal opinion, strengthening CSDP is indispensable not only for European security, but also for greater stability worldwide. In the long run, Europe cannot afford to neglect its role in geopolitics and therefore has to learn to speak the language of power. Integral element of this European strategic responsibility is and will remain close cooperation between EU and NATO. Thank you.
General, thank you very much indeed. And again, thanks for packing a lot of material into a very short space of time. Ladies and gentlemen, with 6 people who intervened, our hour has been completely taken up. I wish there had been the opportunity to have a last round. I think that given that we've got 3 minutes left, I could possibly take maybe one or two, but really quick questions, guys. No statements, if you don't mind, forgive me, but a 1-sentence question. And then I could quickly ask the speakers in 1 sentence to wrap up on the basis of what you said. So let's go really quickly. 1-sentence question, please, sir. Please stand up, because that way we can recognize. Brooks, stand up as well, please, when time comes to you.
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me. Philippe Lefebvre, EEAS. So my quick question is, 2022 is going to be very busy. We have year-to-year negotiations on these processes that aim to effectuate decade-to-decade change. My question to the speakers is, what can be improved on a day-to-day basis to ensure coherence between the EU, NATO, US, transatlantic relations more generally, especially in the implementation of all the documents that will be published in 2022.
Thank you. That was a very long sentence, but it was a single sentence. So you follow. So thanks. So speakers, please note that for your final 1-sentence responses. Again, we can't have a conference without a question from Brooks Tigner. So Brooks, over to you.
Okay, I'm going to fold it all into one long sentence. My question is basically to Charles Friis. It took the Council 4 years to try and reform the Athena Fund. They never got anywhere for financing the BG's deployment. Now we're being told the Compass aims to create a new rapid reaction, modular units, agree the funding for them, organize their exercises and training, and extend their standby status from 6 months to a year, and who's going to pay for that, and create a new, more robust C2 structure here in Brussels, my question is,
Brooks,
are we supposed to believe that all this will be achieved between now and 2025?
Brooks, that was a question with 16 sub-clauses, so you're pulling at the edges again.
Yep.
I could take one final one from Paul Taylor over here, and then we will have to wrap up. So Paul, the microphone comes to you.
It's really an even shorter version of Jaap de Hoop-Scheffer's question, which is, what division of labor is practical and makes sense between the EU and NATO? Is it a geographical one? Is it a sort of big conflict, small conflict one? Is it according to the toolbox? I really think, and is it inside area, outside area? Some kind of division needs to be set out, I think.
Okay, Paul, so thanks. Sorry we didn't have time for more, ladies and gentlemen, but we had, as I said, 6 very good interventions, which made the session very worthwhile. So what we're going to do is Charles, please, Brooks asked you a specific question, so I give you your 1-sentence final word, maybe on that. And if you extend your 1 sentence, like Brooks did with 15 sub-clauses, anything else, but quickly for your final comment. And then I'll ask the other speakers if they have anything on Paul's question and on the question from the gentleman there on the day-to-day priorities. Charles.
Thank you. On the EU rapid deployment capacity, the reasoning is precisely to have a pragmatic and phased approach and to try to deal with the problems that the EU battle groups have faced. The problem of common costs, the problem of the exercises, the battle groups didn't interact together, the problem of the decision-making process, the period of the standby period. So that's why in the Compass we have put forward the necessity to modify substantially the parameters of the battle groups. Member states are attached to this instrument, even if they know that battle groups have never been deployed. But they want to see if it's possible to reform them. So that's why the EEAS has put this, and I think that our approach is reasonable, ambitious, and at the same time realistic, because we are not starting from scratch. Second point to Paul Taylor, the division of labor, it's a long-standing issue. It's not the first time that we have debated on this. I don't think that we need to put in the Bible the division of labor between NATO and the EU. I think, for instance, the United States don't want to do this. I think in the EU also, what we need is to have a good complementarity We have spoken a lot on capabilities, that the capabilities developed in the EU should not lead to unnecessary duplications. We fully agree with this. I think, but I would like to say that complementarity is a two-way street.
Good.
Sometimes NATO should be complementarity, should be act in complementarity with what we are doing, we as the EU, and I have in mind particularly what we are doing in terms of innovation and technology, because we are much more advanced. We have the European Defence Fund.
Okay.
So it's a two-way street.
That's a very strong political point and a very, very good thought. And we, of course, will have our final session today on innovation technology. We'll take that up. Molly, if you're still with us, and again, I really apologise that I have to limit your final word to a sentence, but anything that struck you from the debate, anything you want to say in one sentence in response to those questions that we were able to take.
Sure. Just to say very quickly that I think we have seen that there's a lot of convergence in terms of our perspectives on what needs to be done. And that is terrific. And I would say on this question of division of labor that there are clear comparative advantages that both organizations have, but that I don't think they lend themselves to a strict division of labor on geographic or functional terms. It's going to have to be more modular than that. But we really do look forward to working inside of NATO and with the EU to make sure that we're even more ambitious in what we're trying to accomplish on both ends.
Thanks, Molly. Great to see you and Charles very much joined up there. Cristina, and again, apologies that this is all down to one final sentence, but over to you. No. Whatever you did last time, Cristina, to get the sound working, do it again.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Yes, I agree with the complementarity issue and not a fixed division of labor. It is not possible. I think the best division of labor is collaboration. And let's test the collaboration or advance already the tested collaboration in the specific regions. I referred in my presentation to Africa. Sahel is a great place where the EU is very involved, and we might need, in fact, it might be proof absolutely indispensable to have a greater collaboration of NATO in a specific with our boots on the ground, and in particular as well in the Gulf of Guinea. So in maritime issues, I think it's also a very good area to test the collaboration.
Thanks, Cristina, and that's a good motto, a good devise, that the best division of labour is collaboration. I think we'll remember that. Benedetta, your final sentence.
Okay, sure. I think that the ideas of coherence, the idea of complementarity, collaboration, I think that's the guiding. I think that's the guiding principle. Division of labor is easier to set out in a theoretical than in a practical way, because at least from a NATO perspective, if something fundamentally affects our ability to ensure the security of allies, which is our mission, then we have to care about it. For example, resilience. Many say, well, it's solely civilian. Well, yes, but our militaries cannot move if we don't have the right roads. Yeah. They cannot communicate without the right satellites. So I know I need to wrap up. The problem is the problem is easier said than done. So let's be flexible. Let's work together. We have the same goals of ensuring that we remain at peace. So.
Yes. It's the mission that determines the division rather than the division that determines the mission. Sorry, I'm riffing on the late Don Rumsfeld. But thank you. General, in Vienna, again, your final military sentence, please.
Yeah, thank you. Jamie, you asked me a question on PESCO, which I didn't reply in my keynote, and I think PESCO projects are long-term projects, and the goal is to foster interoperability in between the European armed forces, and therefore we cannot expect very, very short outcome, but we can expect on the long term a better coherence between the European armed forces.
Thank you, General. Thanks very much. Well, I'm not going to give my usual wrap-up, except to say that, to my perspective, the conclusion of today's debate is I've modified the title of the programme, from a zero-sum game with a question mark to a positive-sum game, no question mark. So that is my conclusion. To the speakers, thank you so much again. Again, apologies that we were so constrained on time. To Jaap, as always, thank you for injecting his invaluable perspective. To the three people who asked questions, thank you. To those who didn't have the opportunity, please stay with us. Don't go anywhere because we're not finished, and hopefully there'll be more time for Q&A in the 2 sessions that remain. And I'm now handing over to Mary Fitzgerald. Mary, you're there somewhere to get us underway with the next session on the dawn of multilateralism.